Hello, my name is Cory Gheen, and I'm the chef instructor for the Nutrition and Dietetics Department in the School of Allied Health Professions here at Loma Linda University. The techniques and skills that I teach are culinary in nature and also in food systems, but it's really the kitchen which is my passion and certainly what I enjoy teaching the most. And I always enjoy the questions that the students bring to the classroom and their interest and engagement in the culinary components. I'm very happy to be teaching here in Loma Linda, a place that has such a rich history of food. This kitchen that I'm in right now, in my classroom, has been a teaching kitchen for 80 years or more and has a very rich history. And I like to draw from that, but it's always interesting to me when I go back to the historic menus, when I really look back at the history of what food has been here in Nickel Hall. Those menus can be so simple. I mean, it's boiled peas and stewed nuts, almonds actually on one of the menus that I've read, and roasted potatoes. Very simple, very approachable, very welcoming and comforting foods. When I have questions from my students after class, or when students have things that they want to know more about than what we've just been studying in our lectures, they always have very complicated questions. There's always things that they want to know about that are well beyond the basic skills that we are learning in class, which I think is wonderful because it shows that the students are very engaged in what we're doing in the process. But it also makes me ask the question of, is our expectation of what we're eating maybe more than it really needs to be? In a world today where we have food blogs and we have magazines that are, have these wonderful spreads of beautiful pictures of very complex foods. We have restaurants that have menus that have these amazing sauces and amazing complexity in the foods that they're presenting. Are we maybe getting the wrong impression of what food should be? Now, as we're talking about restaurant food, one of the things that I think a lot of consumers don't really understand is that we often, as chefs, are in fact trying to remove ingredients from our recipes and make things less complicated. Sometimes when you sit down in a restaurant and you look at the food on the plate, you might think, wow, there's so much going on here. There's so much complexity, there's so much color, there's different textures, there's a lot of stuff going on. But in fact, even as a culinary professional, what I'm looking for is to simplify. I want to really showcase an ingredient. I want to really make the food speak for itself in whatever way that I can. Yes, I want there to be intrigue on the plate. Yes, I want there to be an architectural aesthetic to the food that really is eye-catching. But at the same time, if I put an ingredient on there like a tomato, I want that to really resemble, I want you to know that's a tomato. And how do I do that for the most part is that I'll try and remove any ingredients that are superfluous. Things that don't have to be there should be removed. So even in the professional food world, we're really looking at simplification. We're really looking at trying to make the food as approachable as we can. And so at home, doing the same thing can be very powerful. Doing the same thing with the foods that you're cooking every day, where you're really showcasing the ingredient, where you're really showcasing the particular cooking method that you apply to that ingredient, is also very, very important and can be, if utilized correctly, can really give you a dramatic impression for your guests on the particular food that you are presenting to them. And when I talk with my students about it, I often have to remind them to step back to the very basic ideas about what food is. And so there are a lot of areas where we get into that discussion. And certainly one of them is in the ingredients that we use, and I talk about how we want to kind of shift the paradigm about those ingredients. So often we will go to a source for a recipe and we'll find some great recipe that we want to execute. Then we have to go out and find all of the ingredients that that recipe specifies, whether those ingredients are available or not, whether those ingredients are seasonal or not. We still have to follow the recipe. And I think, well, what if we turned that paradigm on its head and said, what if we went and found the ingredients first and then found a recipe to utilize those things? And that would allow us to find the very best ingredients, to buy them in season. Generally, that means they're going to be less expensive, so we can save some money. It's another thing about being in the kitchen that people sometimes forget is it's really easy to make great food when you have great ingredients. But it's really difficult to make great food when you start with inferior ingredients. So ingredient selection is a very important component of making really good food. And it's really that finding the freshest, highest flavored foods that you can that's going to really improve your cooking. It's really good. But then I also have questions about, well, what about equipment? We talk about that a lot. We talk about pots and pans and knives and forks and spoons and all the kitchen implements that we use all the time. And my students often ask when we get into the knife skills class, here I am with these fancy knives and a cutting board and I'm cutting up all of this food, and the one question that always comes up is, what knife should I buy? And that always leads me to the explanation of what knives are needed in a typical kitchen set. You go to a big grocery store, a big box store, and you buy a set of knives, it usually comes with 15, 18 specific implements, and that's way more than most people would ever use. So that's another area where we can simplify food. If there were 3 knives that I would suggest in everybody's repertoire, it would be a chef knife, generally about an 8-inch chef knife, a paring knife, small 2 to 3 inch paring knife, and then something that's serrated, a bread knife style. And those are really the only 3 that are really necessary. Other kitchen equipment that people are always asking about as well, pots and pans, what kind should I have? What material should they be made out of? There's a slew of different items out on the market, and they all have some benefits and some drawbacks. So it is good to ask those questions, but when you think about what types of pots, what sizes of pots, should it be a sauce pot? Should it be, which sauce pot is something very deep? Or should it be a shallow pan? Should I have a non-stick finish? You know, again, I keep those things pretty simplified. I mean, even in my own home, I have 2 saucepans, one that's large and one that's small. For the shallow pans, I have one that has a curved edge and one that has a straight edge, one saute pan, one fry pan. I just don't have a lot of pots and pans because there just doesn't need to be that many, and that's just more stuff for me to have to clean after a meal. So the same thing is true for you at home. I recommend have 2 sizes of the stock pot and 2 sizes of your saute pan, and that's generally all you would need. And literally the only thing that I ever use a non-stick pan for would be for cooking eggs. They're really good for that, but for almost every other use, I don't use a non-stick pan. Now, let's also talk a little bit about seasoning and flavor profiles. I think this is where a lot of people have a lot of questions. My students ask me all the time, how many seasonings should I be thinking about in my own collection, my pantry at home? And what do you use nutmeg for? What do you use marjoram? What's the difference between thyme and oregano? And you know, these are things that a lot of people have never really put them side by side and tasted them. So how do you know what seasoning to use, what flavoring addition to use in what food? Generally, I go back to cultural norms for that and just say what would typically be used in whatever the food item is that I'm making. But really, if you want to have great seasoning, you have to think beyond flavor additions. And what do I mean by that? Seasoning is, in its core essence, salt and pepper. Whether that's black pepper, white pepper, chili pepper, something that has a heat component. Salt and pepper are used as the basic flavorings. However, you have to think about the 5 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Sometimes the addition of salt is not necessary. Sometimes your food actually needs to have a little bump in its sweetness. Sometimes a squeeze of lemon can really highlight the foods. So before you start reaching for all of the seasoning packets, all of the containers of dry spices, stop and look back and say, is the flavor profile balanced? Maybe just a pinch of some white sugar, maybe a couple drops of maple syrup or honey would really highlight the food in the specific way that you're looking for. So I like to bring students back to that kind of elementary understanding of how flavor works, especially on the tongue, and to have them ask those questions of, what is it actually missing? Let's start there when trying to adjust flavor and seasonings. So what about thinking about the menu and how you design a menu for food? Well, that's another area where it can get very complicated very quickly. And certainly from a dietetics perspective, from a nutrition perspective, we like to talk about the fact that you have to have a complete meal. There has to be a protein and a starch and a vegetable. And that is a good way to think about menu planning. But I also think about it from other perspectives. I think about it from an aesthetic perspective of the color and the texture, and how do you make the meal interesting without it being overly complicated. And I talk with my students a lot about basic ratios of meals, ratios of ingredients. For instance, a typical lunch meal should have something starchy, something crispy, something fresh, and something pickled. If you can meet that criteria in a lunch menu, generally you're going to have a very good menu. I like to tell my students that, it's nice to be able to cook everything from scratch, but you don't always need to. And sometimes utilizing convenience products can make meal preparation so much simpler. For instance, there are so many sauces now that you can buy and use as bottled product. They're very good quality, they're very useful, and instead of having to buy a lot of very specialty ingredients to make a simple sauce, if you buy that sauce already prepared, you then can save a lot of money on the cost of buying all those ingredients. So things like stir-fry sauces or teriyaki sauces, those are easy things to have in your collection, in your refrigerator, and be able to use without having to spend a fortune to get them. Another area that you can make a lot of subtle changes in your cooking that can have a huge impact on the variety of the foods that you're serving. When we talk about knife skills with students, I like to remind them that utilizing different cuts on a specific food item can really change the perception of that item when you are serving it and when somebody's eating it. For instance, if you're making a salad and you are used to doing a chopped salad, everything's just in bite-sized pieces, you have very common ingredients that are used in salads very often. There's lettuce and tomato and cucumber and celery. After a while of eating the same salad, people get a little bit bored of it. So what do? Do you find a new dressing? Or do you find a new ingredient to put into the salad? All of those are acceptable options. But what about if you were to simply change the way that food item was cut? So instead of chopping up the carrot, you julienne or shaved that carrot. Those simple changes, that aesthetic change, can completely change the perception of what the person is eating and can make that very common food item something that's very interesting and intriguing and give it a new life. So thinking about subtle changes to food items so that you don't have to go back and learn a new recipe or a new way of cooking in order to make your food interesting again. Another way to do that, if you are talking about having a repertoire of recipes that you utilize all the time, things that you are used to making, so that you don't have to find new things to cook, is to make subtle changes to those ingredients. For instance, in my family, we love pancakes. My kids eat pancakes. They would eat pancakes every day if I let them. But me as a culinarian and my wife as a dietitian, we like to have some variety in our food. So, to please everybody, I have one basic recipe for pancakes, and then I will add ingredients to it to subtly change that recipe every morning. So one day it might be standard white pancake. The next day I might make it with a different type of flour, like corn flour, and make a corn cake. The day after that I might find a nut that I can introduce and make some type of a nut or a spiced cake. And then the day after that, my son, he loves blueberries. So we might mix blueberries into it, or I might make a blueberry sauce to go on the pancakes. My wife loves banana pancakes. That's a childhood favorite of hers. So from time to time, we'll make banana pancakes. So by taking that core recipe, that thing that I'm used to making, that thing that I know how to make really well, and just changing it a little bit here, a little bit there, it makes it so much more fun for the whole family and something that I can continue to introduce without having to learn new skills and finding new recipes and doing a lot of research. So in my conversations with my students, that's what it's always been at the end of class. It's always been about, make sure that you're buying the best ingredients you possibly can. Don't overload your kitchen with too much equipment that you're not going to really find a use for. Find ways of really emphasizing the recipes and the preparations that you love to do. Don't try and recreate the complexity that you find in restaurant menus, and just really enjoy the foods and the space, your home kitchen, the place that you cook a lot. That is the best way to really get the most from what you are doing at home and to please your family and friends, the people that you are cooking for and the people that you are entertaining. This is Chef Cory, and I hope these simple techniques will help you to make your food even more exceptional.